of Mars in Taurus, sort of like a charging bull. Except this bull is charging you interest. So I need to talk about a significant transit that's coming up here in just a few days. Anytime a planet changes signs, it's significant. So on June 8th, right, or June 9th, depending on where you are, Mars, our malefic master of mayhem, will enter the sign of his detriment, which is Taurus, right? And he'll stay there until July 20th. Taurus? More like Boras. Am I right? But we're going to talk a little bit about the symbolism of Mars and Taurus, what it means, and how it affects you personally by doing your horoscopes for the occasion. So make sure you watch until the end. But first, let's look at the fun charts, shall we? This is today, June 6th, when I'm filming, and you can see Mars here in very late Aries. So let's move ahead a few days. Let's go 1, 2. Oh my gosh, Master Mars. Oh my gosh, moving closer. And boom, right? Now he's stuck in the mud in Taurus. Mars is action. And when he's mired in Taurus, he moves in slow motion, right? Mars rules Scorpio. And therefore, he is in detriment or exile in the opposite sign, Taurus, right? So, well, what does Mars mean in astrology? He's violence, aggression, conflict, injuries and illnesses, yes. But he's also passion, drive, and victory, triumph. Notice how all those things, though, require doing something. Now, Taurus, on the other hand, is ruled by Venus, and therefore is sensual, right? She likes to feel good. She likes those good vibrations. She likes to vibrate, doesn't she? That's why I refer to Taurus as clitoris. Yeah, anyway. And she's an earth sign, so she likes nice things. I always remind my Taurus friends that retail therapy doesn't cure most major diseases. Well, she's also feminine and therefore more passive. So she enjoys her comfort, rest, and pleasure, right? She wants a clean house without actually having to get up and clean. She lets the good things from Venus just come to her, right? Shower me with your Venusian fluids. Anyway, but that's why Mars in Taurus gets so uncomfortable. You ever notice how all the Mars stuff requires action, of course? And Taurus has a hard time with that, which is why Mars doesn't feel happy there. It's like he has to go to the bathroom, but he really doesn't want to get up. He just sits there re-chewing his food. Ugh, gross, right? I'm not saying Mars in Taurus is lazy, but it's sort of like if Sisyphus said, fuck it, right? Remember the story of Sisyphus? Like, can't someone else push this heavy-ass ball up the hill? You know, I'd rather not. It's like Mars in Taurus wants you to go down on him while he's playing video games, you know? And he's hoping for the happy ending, isn't he? I think of Mars in Taurus sort of like a charging bull. Except this bull is charging you interest. Mars and Taurus natives are usually slow to anger. But once you get them going, it's even harder to calm them down. Mars's sense of drive faces a lot of resistance in Taurus, which really cramps his style. He'd much rather blame others for his inactivity, rather than putting some effort into accomplishing something. But let's look at some celebrity examples. First, we have Amy Schumer, right? She's pretty lazy. I mean, her jokes are. Boom. Well, then we have Kanye West, or Ye, whatever he calls himself. Hooray! Ye West. He has Mars and Taurus too, right? He derailed his own career, yet spent a lot of time blaming the Jews for it. Please, if you haven't seen that nasty stuff that he said, you have to go be aware, because it's really gross. Well, and then there's Seth Green, right? See, rather than building an illustrious film career, he'd rather just play the dim kid on Family Guy for 25 years, right? I mean, even his character acts like he has Mars in Taurus. Wow. Now remember that Mars rules injuries and illnesses. And Taurus, for the United States, is the 6th house of injuries and illnesses, right? In fact, Mars rejoices in the 6th house, which is where the 6th house gets a lot of its meaning from. From Mars, yeah? So when Mars transits Taurus, we see events having to do with these sorts of things, injuries and illnesses, on a national scale. And last time Mars was in Taurus was July and August of 2022. And during that time, the US had its first confirmed case of polio since 2013. And remember that polio was nearly eradicated after Dr. Jonas Salk invented the polio vaccine in 1955. Vaccines were also highly politicized back then. It's not just a new phenomenon. Well, and then around the same time, the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared monkeypox to be an international public health concern. And then also around the same time, President Joseph Robinette Brandon, Joe Biden, I call him Joseph Robinette Brandon, tested positive for COVID. That was a pretty big deal. But more importantly, what does this mean for you? Well, for that, we have to do your horoscopes for the occasion. Now, remember, in general, Mars in Taurus can be a frustrating time. It's like there's no movement, right? Things aren't getting done. And that's okay. Just settle into it. Try to have realistic goals and expectations for yourself. Overexertion won't pay off here. It will bring burnout, right? Especially for the 6th house types. Mars also brings conflicts. So the house he's transiting in your chart will indicate where those conflicts take place in your life, right? So let's get down to business with those horoscopes, yes? So let's start off with Aries Rising, our Aries Rising Hermes. This means Mars is going into your 2nd house and rules your 1st house as well as your 8th. So there's a lot of financial stuff going on here. When Mars tours our 2nd house, we have to be careful about overspending or overextending our material resources, right? Being that Mars also rules your 8th house of debt, right? You got to be careful with racking up debt. And Mars ruling your 1st house will make you probably want to spend money on yourself, right? Mars going through your 1st house brought some added confidence, some added assertiveness, and it's probably like we want to put on some fancy stuff that matches that feeling. So now you have to watch the over-optimism with your financial situation, right? The 2nd house is our material resources. But let's move on to Taurus Rising. So for our Taurus Rising homies, this means Mars is entering your 1st house, right? After leaving your 12th. Ruling your 12th, yes, as well as your 7th. So, being that Mars rules your 7th, relationships will be indicated here, which is sort of ironic because Mars is in the 1st house of self. But how we relate to ourselves determines how we relate to other people. The fact that Mars also rules your 12th house can indicate that you had some sort of self-destructive behavior that either came out or that you had to deal with over the last month or so, right? And now you have to be careful that you don't hurt yourself from rushing around. Mars in the 1st house brings a sense of assertiveness, right? And a sense of confidence, but we have to be careful that we don't impose ourselves upon our friends and partners, especially partners here, right? So be careful of trying to make your romantic partners do things that they don't want to do because it will end up messing things up later, okay? But let's move on to Gemini Rising, our Gemini Rising Hermes. And this brings Mars into the 12th house, ruling the 11th and the 6th. So you see health complications are highlighted here. Mental health, as well as a need for seclusion. You probably won't want people to bother you. Remember, the 12th house is isolation, mental health, right? All that sort of stuff. sometimes self-destructive behavior, which Mars in the 12th house can bring. It can bring us relapses, right? And I don't just mean substance kind of stuff. I mean being our own worst enemy, you see? Self-undoing is what the 12th house is called, right? And being that it rules the 11th house, you could see difficulties with friends or friends wanting to help you and you sort of rejecting their help or feeling sort of like, oh, stay away from me, right? So you want to practice some comfortable seclusion, enjoy your own company at this time, because you'll probably really not like other people being around. So, but let's move on to our Cancer Rising Hermes. So for Cancer Rising, Mars is going into the 11th house, rules the 10th, and rules the 5th. Yes? So this is a time when you could be having conflicts with friends, right? You might see your sort of idealistic nature or your desire for achievement, being that it's the 10th house, right? That it rules. Remember, the 11th house is hopes, friends, and, optimism and stuff like that. It's also the people who help us, benefactors and patrons. And the 10th house is life direction and career. And the 5th house is children and fun and sex, right? So it could be that either your, what's the word? Your ambition or your desire for pleasure could create conflicts with friends. Like, your friend's like, I think you've had enough. And you're like, I'll tell you when I've had enough. Sometimes we desire achievement to the fact or to the detriment of our relationships. So just be aware of that you could be having tension with your friendships lately. The other thing I see with this is getting bad raps, right? Getting bad attention with Mars in the 11th house, right? Getting a bad reputation. So just watch out for that. But let's move on to Leo Rising, our Leo Rising Hermes. And this puts Mars in the 10th house, ruling the 9th and the 4th. When Mars goes into our 10th house, we usually expect to see, remember, the 10th house is career, life direction, all that sort of stuff. And we expect to see fights with bosses, right? Some people want to quit their job, or some people get into conflicts with an authority figure, or conflicts with coworkers, right? And we alienate ourselves in our job. The other thing we can do, as I said with the last one, is we can sort of get a bad reputation too, right? Because the 10th house is where we're most visible, you see? So be careful. Don't do anything that you wouldn't want to read all over the internet. Just imagine like what you're doing is being posted for 100,000 people on Twitter. I mean, for me, it doesn't matter because I don't really care anyway. I act a fool in public all the time. Now, the other thing you have to be aware of is that the 4th house is highlighted here. So things could come up from your past that you weren't expecting that could give you a bad reputation as well. So just be ready for that kind of stuff. Now let's move on to our Virgo Rising friends, our Virgo Rising Hermes. So for Virgo Rising, this puts Mars going into your 9th house, ruling your 8th and ruling your 3rd. I think of this as conflicts having to do with ideology, religion, politics. This is where we get into fights, isn't it? We get into fights over what we believe. And so the thing here is trying to have an awareness about when it's worth it and when it's not. You're not going to change anyone's mind, most likely. I'm not saying you don't stand up for yourself and hold your own for what's right. But I am saying be wise with your energy. Since Mars rules the 3rd house too, I expect there to be fights or conflicts around beliefs with your extended family. That's like siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, right? It's the kind of stuff we expect to see. But let's move on to our Libra Rising friends. So for our Libra Rising homies, this puts Mars in the 8th house, ruling the 2nd and ruling the 7th. So it's sort of like the opposite of Aries Rising, isn't it? And we see the whole financial axis, right? Highlighted again. Remember, the 8th house is other people's money, other people's stuff, debt, taxes, and death, right? And remember, the 2nd house is your wealth, your resources. So with Mars ruling the 2nd and being in the 8th, that further indicates unforeseen expenses, perhaps putting you in more debt, right? So you need to save for a rainy day, please. This is not the time to be spending willy-nilly, because it will come back to bite you in the ass when all of a sudden your car breaks down or an appliance goes out, something like that, where you have to spend a good amount of money that you don't have to fix something. Okay? So just be aware of that. Now, Mars also ruling the 7th house could indicate having to share income with a spouse or a partner, and more precisely, losing income through a spouse or partner, right? Because the 8th house is also losses. So just be aware of that, please. But now let's move on to our Scorpio rising friends, our Scorpio rising Hermes. So this puts Mars in the 7th house of partnerships, right? Usually romantic relationships, but it can also be opponents, right? Mars rules the 6th house, yes, and your 1st house. So when you have your 1st house ruler here in your 7th house, something about your ego, something about your particularity, something about the way you need things, causes rifts in your relationships. You may have already gone through a breakup, but it's likely that you're going to say or do harsh things that could create another breakup, especially if you have multiple partners. But if you have one particular partner, you could see some schisms, some conflicts. You want to watch what you say, right? Remember that there are some words you can't take back. I should know. But anyway, remember that Mars also rules the 1st house, as we said, right? As well as the 6th house. And the 6th house, as we'll see in a second, has to do with health and injuries and illnesses. So you might see a partner have to deal with an injury or an illness or something, and you may have to help, or it may cause conflicts with you because it interferes with your 1st house independence. So just be ready for that. But let's move on to Snajimattarius Rising Hermes. So this puts Mars going into your 6th house, which we just said is health, wellness, injuries, illnesses, and obligations. Mars, of course, rules the 5th house of children and pleasure here, as well as the 12th house of self-destruction, right? Self-undoing. So anyway, with Mars going into the 6th house where he rejoices, he often finds the gumption and the drive to start getting things done, to start knocking things off the list. You see? That's why Mars rejoices in the 6th house, because the 6th house is all the shit that you don't want to do, that we typically avoid. But if we don't do it, things start falling apart. So Mars in the 6th house often indicates being able to get stuff done. However, it can also lead you to burnout. Yes? It can lead you to burnout. And being that the 12th house is also brought in here, that's very likely. So you want to practice some self-care. You want to take things easy. Give yourself enough time. Give yourself enough rest. Remember, Mars is still in Taurus, and there's going to be a lot of resistance to accomplishing things. So please. Now, because it's the 5th house also, you may have a sick child. You may have a sick child or have to deal with a sexual problem or illness, perhaps. So just be aware of that too, my sweet. Now let's move on to Crapricorn, our Crapricorn Rising Hermes. So this puts Mars going into the 5th house, ruling the 4th, as well as the 11th. And whenever I see Mars going into the 5th house, I always say to my fellow parents, I'm like, your kids are going to be a pain in the ass. I'm sorry. When Mars goes through my 5th house, my daughter constantly tells me no, right? We face a lot of resistance with things. Or sometimes they're just generally cranky and unruly. Now, the other thing that can happen, especially if you don't have kids, or even if you do, is it lifts your libido. It increases your drive for pleasure, which sometimes can consume us. I know, Sure does with me. So you might notice that you're extra amorous, but you don't always need someone to take care of you. You can take care of yourself, right? There's always that. Now, the other thing is that Mars rules the 4th house here. So Something to do with your home or living situation could be highlighted here along with your kids. Maybe your kid like breaks something big around the house, or you have to clean up a big mess or something after them. You know, maybe they want to play jacuzzi in the toilet. I don't know. But the 11th house is also here. So having fun with friends, but sometimes too much fun. So just take it easy, my Cap Rising homies. But let's move on to Aquarius Rising. This is me. Oops, wrong way. This is me, Aquarius Rising. Aquarius Rising, friends. This means Mars is entering our 4th house, ruling our 3rd as well as our 10th. You see? So, when Mars goes into the 4th house, we often have little conflicts with our living situation or our parents. Sometimes we feel like we have to cut ourselves off from our family or the past. You see, the 4th house is the home, the father, the legacy, right? There could be something about your family legacy that you end up finding absolutely repellent, and you have to cut that off. Remember that Mars also rules the 3rd house of siblings and extended family. So there could be something where a sibling comes to stay with you, or a family member comes to stay with you, and it really drives you nuts. Actually, I really do hope my brother comes to stay with me. That would be wonderful. But you never know. It can create tension and fights. Remember, the 10th house is also highlighted here. So bringing your private life out into public. That's another thing I'm quite accustomed to. So, if you're not accustomed to being a very public type person, then keep your mouth closed. It's better to remain silent and thought a fool than it is to open one's mouth and remove all doubt. But anyway, let's move on to Pisces Rising. Our Pisces Rising Hermes. So for Pisces Rising, this puts Mars in the 3rd house of siblings, right? An extended family, communication, all that fun stuff, ruling your 2nd house and ruling your 9th house. So sort of the opposite of our Virgo Rising Hermes. When Mars goes into the 3rd house, though, I think of sharp tongues. I think of saying stuff that you wish you could take back. And you can't, right? Sometimes these things do cause conflicts in our relationships, particularly siblings and extended family. You could find yourself getting into an argument about money with a sibling, right? Because it rules the 2nd house. Or perhaps you owe money to a sibling and you have to straighten those sorts of things out. But road rage is also a big thing. I also see ideological fights, right? Because Mars rules the 9th house. And I think of harsh words in ideological conflicts and skirmishes, about politics or religion or whatever. So just be careful. The number one thing, though, I always say is watch your words here. Watch your mouth. I mean, that takes a mirror, doesn't it? Because these things could end up hurting relationships that you wish you still had. But anyway, I hope that was useful. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Comment below because I want to know what you think and it helps me out with the algorithm. Also, please click the bell when you subscribe so that you get notified when my new videos drop. And my videos are the best. Well, also please consider tipping me. Please, please, please. Your tips and your support keep me making all this wonderful content. And I'm very cute, and I'm very funny, and I know my stuff. So please help. Help me, please. You can either tip by using super thanks down below, or you can go to my Patreon over there, or go to my PayPal link. Everything is below in the description. So please and thank you. Also, I do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website, frankielynch.com, or, once again, all my contact information is below. And also, if you can't afford to tip me, just watch all my videos, all the way through, including the silly commercials. But then you don't have to pay me because advertisers will. But most importantly, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a spectacular, whatever it is you're having.